Case 1. Susan Eubanks. Her name was Susan Eubanks, and on the night of October 15, 1996, she loaded a gun, walked through her own house in San Marcos, California, and shot all 4 of her sons as they slept. Brandon was 14 years old. Matthew was 10. Nicholas was 7. Michael was 4 years old. All 4 boys were killed by their own mother before she turned the gun on herself in what she later claimed was a suicide attempt. She survived. Her children did not. Let that settle for a moment. Susan Eubanks was 30 years old at the time of the murders. She was living in San Marcos, in San Diego County, in a modest family home. By the accounts of neighbors and acquaintances at the time, there was nothing that visibly flagged her as dangerous. She was a mother of 4. She was described in early reports as overwhelmed, struggling, going through personal difficulties, language that, when we hear it now in hindsight, feels deeply insufficient for what she was about to do. The background to October 15, 1996, is rooted in a breakdown of Susan Eubanks' personal relationships. She had 4 sons by different fathers, and the relationships with those men had deteriorated significantly. There were custody disputes. There was bitterness. There were court proceedings over visitation and child support. According to testimony and documentation that emerged during the trial, Susan Eubanks had developed a consuming rage, not just toward the fathers of her children, but toward the circumstances of her own life. What investigators and prosecutors would later argue, and what the jury would ultimately agree with, was that Susan Eubanks did not kill her sons out of psychosis or detachment from reality. She killed them deliberately, methodically, out of spite toward the fathers who, she believed, had wronged her. She used her children as instruments of punishment against the men she hated. She took from those men the very thing that could hurt them most. She took their sons. The night of the murders unfolded in a sequence that is almost impossible to process. Susan Eubanks put her boys to bed. There was nothing in the testimony to suggest the children were alarmed or in distress before they went to sleep. Brandon, Matthew, Nicholas, and little Michael, 4 boys ranging from 14 years old down to 4, were in their beds, in their home, trusting the person who was supposed to be their protector. Susan Eubanks picked up a firearm. She walked into the rooms of her sleeping children, one by one, and she shot them. Brandon Eubanks, 14 years old, was shot in his bedroom. Matthew Eubanks, 10 years old, was shot in his bedroom. Nicholas Eubanks, 7 years old, was shot in his bedroom. Michael Eubanks, 4 years old, was shot in his bedroom. After killing all 4 of her sons, Susan Eubanks shot herself in the torso. The self-inflicted wound was not fatal. When law enforcement arrived at the scene in San Marcos in the early hours of October 16th, they found a house containing 4 dead children and 1 surviving adult. The scene that greeted those responding officers has been described in court documents in terms that those involved said they never recovered from professionally. For children, for bedrooms, the silence of a house where minutes before there had been 4 heartbeats. Susan Eubanks was taken into custody after receiving medical treatment for her self-inflicted wound. The investigation moved quickly. There was no question of what had happened or who had done it. The question before the court, and the question that would define whether Susan Eubanks lived or died, was why. The prosecution, led by San Diego County District Attorney's Office, argued for the death penalty. They presented a case built on deliberation, premeditation, and a motive rooted not in madness but in calculated vengeance. Prosecutors argued that Susan Eubanks had made a conscious, reasoned decision to destroy the thing that mattered most to the fathers of her children. They called witnesses to her state of mind in the days and weeks before the murders. They presented evidence of her ongoing anger, her sense of grievance, and her statements to others about the custody disputes that had consumed her. The defense attempted to introduce mental health considerations. They presented testimony about Susan Eubanks' psychological state, her history, and her emotional deterioration. Defense attorneys argued that she had been in a state of profound mental distress that impaired her judgment and her capacity to understand the full consequences of what she was doing. The jury did not agree. In 1998, Susan Eubanks was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury recommended the death penalty. San Diego Superior Court Judge David Samosky sentenced Susan Eubanks to death. She was sent to death row at the California Institution for Women. The aftermath of this case rippled through San Diego County in ways that extended well beyond the courtroom. The fathers of the four boys, men who had been embroiled in custody and support battles with Susan Eubanks, had to live with the knowledge that their sons had been killed precisely because of the conflict between their mother and the men who had fathered them. The children had been caught in the middle of adult hatred, and they had paid for it with their lives. Child welfare advocates and legal scholars pointed to the Susan Eubanks case as a stark illustration of what happens when the systems designed to protect children, family courts, social services, law enforcement, fail to identify escalating danger within a household. There were no documented welfare checks on the Eubanks children in the period immediately preceding the murders. There were no formal flags raised about the boys' safety despite the documented deterioration of their mother's emotional state. Brandon was 14. He was in high school. He had a future that was 14 years in the making. Matthew was 10. He was at the age where the world is still enormous and full of possibility. Nicholas was 7. He had barely begun. Michael was 4 years old. He was a baby. Susan Eubanks took all of it. Every future, every possibility, every year those boys had not yet lived. Gone in a single night, in their own beds, in the home they were supposed to be safe in. As of the time of this documentary's research, Susan Eubanks remains on death row at the California Institution for Women. California's execution moratorium, implemented by Governor Gavin Newsom in March of 2019, means that no execution has been carried out in the state since 2006. Susan Eubanks continues to live. Her sons do not. Brandon, Matthew, Nicholas, Michael, 4 boys, gone. We remember them. Case 2. Teresa Cross Knorr. There are cases in true crime history that, when you read the full scope of what happened, you have to stop and sit with them. You have to put them down and come back. The story of Teresa Cross Knorr and what she did to her daughters inside a series of rented houses in Sacramento, California, is one of those cases. This is not a story of a single violent act. This is a story of years. Years of systematic, escalating, deliberate torture and murder carried out by a mother against her own children. Children who had nowhere to go, no one to call, and no way out. Teresa Francine Cross was born on March 5, 1946, in Sacramento, California. She married young, and over the course of 2 marriages, she became the mother of 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. It is the 2 girls whose stories we are here to tell. Their names were Susan Knorr and Sheila Sanders, and what their mother did to them belongs in the most disturbing chapter of California's criminal history. By the 1970s and 1980s, Teresa Knorr was living with her children in a succession of rented homes in the Sacramento area. She was morbidly obese, deeply insecure, prone to explosive and unpredictable violence, and consumed by a paranoid jealousy that she directed, horrifyingly, at her own daughters. Teresa Knorr saw the beauty and youth of her daughters as a threat, not to her family, not to some external danger, but to herself. She was jealous of her own children. She was threatened by them, and she made them pay for it. The abuse that Teresa Knorr inflicted on her children, and particularly on Sheila and Susan, has been documented in court testimony, FBI reports, and in the accounts of the surviving children who eventually came forward. It included starvation, severe physical beatings, being forced to live in confinement, being denied medical care, being forced to perform labor in conditions of near slavery, and acts of sadistic cruelty that escalated over years without any outside intervention. Teresa Knorr operated in a closed household. She isolated her children from the outside world. She controlled what they said, where they went, and who they interacted with. The older boys in the family, Robert, William, and Howard Knorr, were not only complicit witnesses to the abuse of their sisters, but were, on multiple documented occasions, actively directed by their mother to participate in the abuse. This coercion of older siblings against younger ones is one of the most disturbing elements of the Knorr case. The systematic destruction of the bonds between children in order to consolidate the mother's power and eliminate any possibility of solidarity or escape. Sheila Gay Sanders was Teresa's daughter from an earlier relationship. She was, by all accounts, a beautiful young woman, and it was precisely this that drew her mother's toxic jealousy. Sheila attempted, more than once, to escape the household. Each attempt was met with escalating punishment. In the early 1980s, Teresa Knorr shot Sheila. The bullet lodged near Sheila's spine. Rather than seek medical care, which would have exposed the abuse and led to intervention, Teresa Knorr refused to take Sheila to a hospital. She left the bullet inside her daughter's body. Sheila suffered in agony. The wound became infected. Teresa Knorr's response was not to get help. Her response was to intensify the abuse and restrict Sheila's food and movement further, as if by dominating her daughter completely, she could dominate the physical reality of what she had done. Sheila Sanders died from the infected wound. She was 20 years old. Teresa Knorr, with the involvement of her sons, disposed of Sheila's body. The remains were dumped in Placer County, California, where they were discovered in July of 1984 by hikers. For years, the remains were unidentified, listed in law enforcement records simply as a Jane Doe. Susan Knorr was Teresa's next target. If Sheila's death had given Teresa Knorr any pause, any moment of reflection or conscience, none of it was visible in what she did next. Susan endured years of abuse that included being locked in closets, being denied food, being beaten, and being subjected to conditions of captivity inside her own home. Teresa Knorr, in an act that seems almost incomprehensible in its evil, at some point concluded that Susan was a witch, that Susan was using supernatural powers against her. She used this delusion, or this fabricated justification, to rationalize what she did next. In 1984, Teresa Knorr set her daughter Susan on fire. Susan Knorr survived the initial burning, horribly injured, with severe burns across her body. Once again, Teresa Knorr refused to seek medical care. Once again, the refusal was deliberate. Medical care would mean exposure, would mean questions, would mean the end of the closed world she had constructed. Susan lingered in agony without treatment. She died of her injuries. Her remains were also disposed of by Teresa Knorr and her sons. Susan's body was left in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Squaw Valley, where it was found in July of 1984, the same month as Sheila's remains, though the connection was not immediately apparent to investigators. Susan Knorr was approximately 21 years old when she died. For years, both Sheila and Susan were unidentified remains in California cold case files. Their mother continued to live. Their brothers continued to live. The closed system of the Knorr household had functioned exactly as Teresa intended. Complete silence, complete concealment, complete impunity. The case broke open in 1993, nearly a decade after both daughters were dead, when one of Teresa Knorr's sons, Robert Knorr Jr., walked into a police station and told investigators what had happened inside the family home. He had carried the weight of it for years. His decision to come forward ended the silence. Investigators were able to connect the Jane Doe remains found in Placer County and Squaw Valley in 1984 to Sheila Sanders and Susan Knorr using dental records and other identifying information. The cold cases that had sat in files for 9 years were suddenly very much alive. Teresa Cross Knorr was arrested in 1993. She was living in Salt Lake City, Utah, at the time of her arrest. She was extradited back to California to face charges. In 1995, Teresa Cross Knorr pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, the murders of her daughters Sheila Sanders and Susan Knorr. In exchange for her guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. Teresa Knorr was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The surviving children of Teresa Knorr, those who had been witnesses, and in some cases participants under coercion, faced their own legal and psychological reckonings. Robert Knorr Jr., whose cooperation broke the case open, reached a plea agreement with prosecutors. Other family members faced varying degrees of legal scrutiny. Teresa Cross Knorr died in prison on July 28, 2019, at the age of 73. She never fully explained the depth of what she had done. She never gave an account that satisfied those who sought to understand it. Sheila Sanders and Susan Knorr were not famous. They were not on the news when they were alive and suffering. They were invisible, invisible inside their own home, invisible to a system that never found them, invisible in death for 9 years before anyone even knew their names. This case is a monument to the danger of isolation, the failure of systems, and the capacity for evil to thrive in silence. We say their names. Sheila, Susan. We remember them. Case 3. Louise Anna Turpin. On the morning of January 14, 2018, a 17-year-old girl escaped from a house on Muir Woods Road in Perris, California. She was malnourished, small for her age, and clutching a deactivated cell phone she had been planning this escape with for 2 years. She ran to a neighbor's house and called 911. What law enforcement found when they responded to that address is one of the most shocking child abuse discoveries in modern American history. Inside that house were 13 people. 12 of them were children and young adults ranging in age from 2 years old to 29 years old. All of them were the children of David Allen Turpin and Louise Anna Turpin, and nearly all of them were malnourished, shackled, and living in conditions of captivity and filth that investigators later described as unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. Louise Anna Robinette was born on June 25, 1961, in West Virginia. She met David Turpin in her teenage years. They were married in 1984 when Louise was 22 and David was 21. Over the following decades, they had 13 children together. 13. On the surface, the Turpin family maintained a carefully constructed facade. They had homeschool registration documentation filed with California authorities. They posted family photographs on social media, smiling children, matching outfits, choreographed images of apparent normalcy. They had a renewal of vows ceremony at Graceland in Las Vegas. They appeared, to those who only saw the surface, to be an eccentric but devoted family. The reality behind closed doors was the opposite of everything that facade suggested. The 13 Turpin children were subjected to a regime of abuse that had been ongoing for years. In some cases, for the entire lives of the younger children. They were systematically starved. The children were fed once a day, sometimes once every few days. Portions were tiny. The children were so malnourished that several of the adults, who were in their 20s chronologically, had the bone density and physical development of children far younger. One of the adult daughters weighed 82 pounds at the time of rescue. The children were not allowed to eat the food that was present in the home. There was food in the kitchen, food that was displayed, food that was occasionally cooked, but the children were forbidden from eating it. They watched food exist and could not touch it. Some of the children reportedly did not know what a police officer was. Some had never been to a doctor. Some had never been to a dentist. Some had never been allowed outside the house. They were shackled, not metaphorically, physically shackled, with chains and padlocks, to their beds. According to testimony from investigators and the children themselves, the shackling was used as punishment, sometimes for minor infractions such as touching food or washing their hands above the wrists. Children who were shackled remained that way for days, weeks, and in some documented cases, months at a time. They were denied access to bathroom facilities while shackled, forced to remain in their own waste. The smell inside the Turpin house when investigators entered on January 14, 2018, was described in reports as overwhelming. The darkness, the filth, the physical state of the captive children. Investigators who entered that house have spoken publicly about the lasting psychological impact of what they saw. Louise Turpin and David Turpin were arrested on January 14, 2018, and charged with a total of 75 counts between them. These charges included torture, child abuse, dependent adult abuse, false imprisonment, and related offenses. The case moved slowly through the California court system, as cases of this complexity tend to do. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of the children, now freed, now receiving medical care and psychological support for the first time in their lives, as well as on the physical evidence gathered from inside the Muir Woods Road house. In February of 2019, Louise Turpin pleaded guilty to 14 counts, including torture and child abuse. David Turpin also pleaded guilty to 14 counts. At sentencing in April of 2019, both Louise and David Turpin were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentencing hearing included, in an extraordinary moment, statements from several of the Turpin children themselves. Read aloud in court. Their words described years of darkness, hunger, pain, and isolation, but also, remarkably, resilience. Some of the children spoke of hope. Some spoke of what they wanted for their futures. Some spoke of their belief in God. That any of these children retained the capacity for hope after what they had endured is something that speaks to a strength of the human spirit that is almost beyond comprehension. The aftermath of the Turpin case has been complex and, at times, additionally troubling. After their rescue, the children were placed in foster care. A 2021 investigation by ProPublica and the Desert Sun newspaper found that several of the Turpin children had experienced additional difficulties and in some cases further abuse within the California foster care system. A deeply disturbing revelation that added layers of institutional failure to an already catastrophic story. Advocacy for the Turpin survivors has continued, with legal and welfare organizations working on their behalf. Louise Anna Turpin and David Turpin are currently serving their sentences in California's prison system. Their earliest possible parole eligibility date is 25 years from sentencing. 13 children. Years of chains. One girl who found the courage to run. We remember Jordan and all of her brothers and sisters. We remember that courage. And we remember that systems still fail children every single day. Case 4. Cheryl Massop. This case sits at one of the most uncomfortable intersections in American criminal law, the intersection between mental illness, maternal filicide, and the question of criminal responsibility. It divided legal scholars, mental health professionals, and the people of Orange County, California, when it came to trial. And its outcome remains controversial to this day. Her name was Cheryl Massop, and in April of 1987, she killed her 6-week-old son Michael. Cheryl Massop was 26 years old in the spring of 1987, living in Anaheim, California, with her husband and their newborn son. Michael Massop was born in March of 1987, a healthy infant boy. By every external measure, Cheryl Massop was a woman who had everything to live for: a marriage, a new baby, a home. But something had gone profoundly wrong. In the weeks following Michael's birth, Cheryl Massop began to deteriorate. She exhibited symptoms that, in the clinical literature, are associated with severe postpartum psychosis, a rare but serious mental health condition that can follow childbirth and that, in its most extreme manifestations, causes hallucinations, delusions, and a complete break from reality. This is distinct from postpartum depression, which is far more common and generally less acutely dangerous. Postpartum psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. According to the defense case and the testimony of mental health experts who evaluated Cheryl Massop, she had developed a delusional belief that her son was possessed, that he was not her real child, or that harm was coming to him from sources she could not rationally identify. She was, according to those who examined her, experiencing a psychotic break at the time she killed her son. On April 14, 1987, Cheryl Massop placed her 6-week-old son Michael in the path of her car and ran over him. He died from his injuries. The act was witnessed. Law enforcement responded. Cheryl Massop was taken into custody. The investigation and subsequent legal proceedings were contentious from the beginning. The prosecution's position was that regardless of Cheryl Massop's mental state, she had committed the deliberate act of killing her child and needed to be held criminally responsible. The defense argued, strenuously, that Cheryl Massop was not legally sane at the time of the act, that she did not understand the nature of what she was doing or that it was wrong, by the legal standard for the insanity defense in California. At trial in 1988, the jury convicted Cheryl Massop of second-degree murder. The case did not end there. Orange County Superior Court Judge Robert Fitzgerald, in a ruling that generated significant controversy and national attention, overturned the jury's verdict. Judge Fitzgerald substituted a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, finding that the evidence of Cheryl Massop's severe postpartum psychosis was so overwhelming that no reasonable jury, properly instructed, could have found her sane at the time of the crime. The prosecution appealed. The case wound through the California appellate system. Eventually, the appellate court reinstated elements of the original conviction, but the case had already become a landmark in discussions about postpartum psychosis, criminal responsibility, and the inadequacy of the legal system in addressing severe maternal mental illness. Cheryl Massop was ultimately committed to a state psychiatric facility rather than prison. She received treatment. She was eventually released. The Cheryl Massop case forced California, and the broader American legal system, to confront a painful question. When a mother kills her child because of a mental illness so severe that she has lost contact with reality, what does justice look like? Is incarceration the answer? Is treatment? Can a woman who did not understand what she was doing be held to the same standard of criminal responsibility as someone who acts with full deliberation and intent? There are no easy answers. And the discomfort of that, the discomfort of a case that sits outside the clean categories of evil and mentally ill, that forces us to hold complexity and grief simultaneously, is precisely why the Mossip case still matters. What is not in dispute is what was lost. Michael Mossip was 6 weeks old. He had been alive for 42 days. He had not even begun. We hold space for Michael, and for the terrible complexity of what happened to him and to his mother. We do not look away from either truth. Case 5. Carol Bundy. Most people who know the name Carol Bundy associate it with the Sunset Strip Killers case, the string of murders committed in the Los Angeles area in 1980 and 1981 alongside her partner Douglas Clark. But there is a dimension of Carol Bundy's crimes that often gets overshadowed by the sensational nature of that case, and it is one that belongs squarely within this documentary. Carol Bundy was a mother. She had 2 young sons, and what she exposed them to, and what she did in their presence and in the space of their lives, represents a form of maternal failure and criminal conduct that is both deeply relevant to our subject and deeply disturbing. Carol Mary Peters was born on August 26, 1942, in Los Angeles, California. Her early life was marked by abuse, neglect, and instability. By her own account, and by the accounts of those who knew her history, Carol grew up in conditions of profound dysfunction. A father who was violent and abusive, a childhood characterized by trauma and inadequate care. She married multiple times. She had 2 sons from one of those relationships. By the time she was in her late 30s, Carol Bundy was living in a Van Nuys apartment complex in Los Angeles, morbidly obese, nearly blind without her thick-lensed glasses, deeply lonely, and emotionally vulnerable in ways that made her susceptible to manipulation by dominant personalities. In 1979, she became involved with her apartment building's manager, a man named John Murray, in a relationship that was emotionally and sexually controlling. When that relationship ended, Carol Bundy became romantically involved with Douglas Daniel Clark, a man who worked at the Jergens soap factory in Los Angeles. Clark was charming, manipulative, and extraordinarily dangerous. He harbored detailed, violent sexual fantasies, and he found in Carol Bundy a willing, desperate partner who would do almost anything to preserve the relationship. Between June and August of 1980, Douglas Clark murdered at least 6 young women and girls in the Los Angeles area, most of them along Sunset Boulevard. The victims were predominantly young women working in survival sex work, runaways, and vulnerable young people. Clark engaged in acts of necrophilia and other forms of sadistic violence. Carol Bundy's involvement in the murders, the extent to which she participated, facilitated, and covered up the crimes, became the subject of extensive investigation and trial testimony. What is documented and adjudicated is this: Carol Bundy participated in at least 1 murder directly. She also independently killed her former lover, John Murray, in August of 1980, shooting him in his van and then decapitating him. The decapitation was, according to her own statements and the prosecution's case, connected to her fear that Murray would reveal information about the Sunset Strip murders to law enforcement. Carol Bundy ultimately cooperated with law enforcement and testified against Douglas Clark in exchange for consideration in her own sentencing. Her sons, her children. During the period of the murders, Carol Bundy's young sons were in the home. They were witnesses, in various degrees, to their mother's relationship with Clark, a relationship that brought active, documented serial killing into the household. The full scope of what the boys knew, saw, or were told has never been entirely public, but what is clear is that Carol Bundy's choices placed her children in proximity to one of the most sadistic killers in Los Angeles history. The fact that she was their mother, and that her choices defined the world those children inhabited, is something that this documentary cannot pass over in silence. Carol Bundy was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in 1983. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 27 years. She was incarcerated at the California Institution for Women. Carol Bundy died in prison on December 9, 2003, at the age of 61, of heart failure. Douglas Clark was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He remains on death row. The victims of the Sunset Strip murders, young women whose lives were taken on the streets of Los Angeles, deserve to be named. Gina Morano, Cynthia Chandler, Exie Wilson, Karen Jones, Marnette Comer, and Mickey Anderson. Their names should not be footnotes to the story of their killers. We say their names. Case 6. Kathleen Gagnon. There is a form of child abuse that is invisible to the naked eye. It does not leave bruises, at least not at first. It does not register as violence in the way that a blow or a wound does. It happens in hospital rooms, in the presence of medical professionals, in spaces specifically designed to protect and heal. It is called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, now more commonly referred to in clinical literature as factitious disorder imposed on another, and it is one of the most insidious forms of child abuse that exists. The perpetrator, almost always a mother, creates or fabricates illness in her child. She does it for attention, for sympathy, for a sense of power and identity built around the role of the heroic, devoted mother of a sick child. And the child pays for it with their health, their childhood, and sometimes their life. The state of California has seen multiple cases of this form of abuse. One of the most thoroughly documented is that of Kathleen Gagnon of the Los Angeles area, whose case became a reference point for medical and legal professionals studying this deeply complex form of abuse. Kathleen Gagnon was a California mother whose son, referred to in court documents and medical records with privacy protections for child victims, spent years of his young life in and out of hospitals. He underwent procedure after procedure. He was subjected to test after test. He was treated for conditions that his mother described to medical staff with elaborate, detailed, and often shifting symptom presentations. Medical teams worked diligently to diagnose and treat him. He was not naturally ill. He was being made ill. Over time, through the painstaking investigative work of medical staff at institutions where the boy was treated, staff who grew increasingly suspicious about the pattern of the child's illnesses and the consistency of the mother's presence as the only witness to his symptoms, a case began to build. Covert video surveillance, conducted legally and ethically with hospital administration oversight, documented Kathleen Gagnon interfering with her son's medical treatment in ways designed to cause or prolong his illness. The surveillance footage, the same type of evidence that has been crucial in numerous Munchausen by proxy cases nationally, provided prosecutors with the foundation for criminal charges. The investigation and prosecution of Munchausen by proxy cases is extraordinarily difficult. The perpetrator is, by definition, a skilled deceiver. She has constructed a persona, the exhausted but devoted mother of a sick child, that generates sympathy from everyone around her. Medical staff, social workers, family members, and community members rally around her. To suggest that she is, in fact, causing the illness is to make a claim that feels almost impossible to most people. But the evidence in the Gagnon case was, ultimately, incontrovertible. Kathleen Gagnon was convicted of child abuse and related charges. The case drew significant attention from the medical community in California, contributing to the development of protocols for identifying and responding to suspected Munchausen by proxy situations in hospital settings. The long-term physical and psychological impact on children who have been subjected to this form of abuse is severe and well documented in clinical literature. They have undergone unnecessary medical procedures. They have had toxic substances introduced into their bodies. They have been conditioned to understand themselves as permanently sick. They have been deprived of normal childhoods. The harm is real, lasting, and in some cases permanent. We include this case not to sensationalize but to illuminate, because this form of abuse happens in the most unlikely seeming places, perpetrated by the most unlikely seeming people, and it is invisible until someone looks very closely and refuses to be charmed by the performance. Case 7. Raquel Barrientos. The Mojave Desert in Southern California is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Water sources are scarce. The sun is absolute and unforgiving. To be left in the desert without water, without shade, without protection, is to be sentenced to death by environment. In the summer of 2003, Raquel Barrientos drove her children into the Mojave Desert and left them there. Her daughter Genesis was 5 years old. Her son was younger. She drove away. Raquel Barrientos was a young mother in the Inland Empire area of Southern California whose circumstances, poverty, instability, mental health challenges, substance use, were documented by social services in the period before the abandonment. Her children had come to the attention of welfare agencies. There were flags. There were notes and files. There were caseworkers. And then there was a desert road and 2 small children. The children were found. Genesis and her brother were recovered, dehydrated and traumatized, but alive. The recovery of those 2 children was a near thing, a matter of hours making the difference between rescue and death. Raquel Barrientos was located, arrested, and charged with child abandonment and child endangerment. The prosecution's case documented both the deliberate act of driving into the desert and the extended period of abuse and neglect that had preceded it. She was convicted. She received a sentence that included prison time and a permanent loss of parental rights over her children. The Barrientos case, and cases like it, force a reckoning with the systems designed to intervene before children reach the point of danger. The files existed. The case workers had visited. The flags had been raised. And yet Genesis and her brother ended up alone in the Mojave. This pattern of documentation without intervention, of identification without protection, is one of the recurring tragedies in California's child welfare history. California's Child Protective Services system has faced years of documented underfunding, understaffing, and case overload. Caseworkers carry caseloads far beyond what research indicates is manageable for effective family monitoring. The result is that children who are known to be at risk do not receive the frequency or quality of intervention that their situations demand. Genesis survived. She went on, through the California foster care system, into an uncertain future. We hope for her. We hold space for what she endured, not just the desert, but the years before it, and the years after it, navigating a system that had already failed her once. We remember Genesis. Case 8, Marina Hamilton. Fire is one of the oldest weapons human beings have used against one another, and it is among the most devastating methods by which children have been murdered by the people who were supposed to protect them. The physical evidence of arson, the pattern of burn marks, the origin points, the chemical signatures of accelerants, can survive the fire itself. And when that evidence points to a mother as the source of the blaze that killed her children, what follows is one of the most devastating categories of criminal prosecution. In the early 2000s, the Fremont area of Alameda County, California saw a fire investigation that began as a tragedy and ended as a murder prosecution. Marina Hamilton was a California mother whose children, 2 young children under the age of 6, died in a house fire that initially appeared to be an accident. Fire investigators from the Fremont Fire Department and Alameda County Fire Investigation teams conducted a full forensic examination of the scene. The evidence they found, the origin point of the fire, the pattern of its spread, the presence of accelerant material, did not support the conclusion of accidental fire. They concluded the fire had been set. Marina Hamilton was the person who had been home with the children at the time. She had survived. Her children had not. The investigation was lengthy, and the prosecution's case was built painstakingly on the fire investigation evidence and on the testimony of the children's deaths and the circumstances surrounding them. The defense challenged the arson science, a challenge that is common in fire investigation cases, where the scientific standards for determining arson versus accidental fire have been scrutinized and, in some national cases, found wanting. But in this case, the prosecution's expert testimony held up under scrutiny. Marina Hamilton was convicted of the murders of her children. She was sentenced to life in prison. The case is a reminder that the evidence of a crime does not disappear when the crime is committed with fire. Physical evidence survives. Science persists. And the children who die in flames set by the people who should have protected them are not forgotten. They are found, and they are remembered, and justice is pursued on their behalf. Case 9, Laverne Ward. Of all the ways a child can be harmed, starvation is among the most prolonged, the most preventable, and the most painful. It is not a sudden act of violence. It is a slow withdrawal, day by day, meal by meal, ounce by ounce, of the thing every living creature needs to survive. A starved child does not die quickly. They decline. They grow weaker. They lose weight that they cannot afford to lose. They become, over weeks and months, less and less present in the world until they are gone. In Sacramento County, in 2009, a child named Shane Ward died of starvation. He was 4 years old. He weighed 29 pounds. His mother was Laverne Ward. Laverne Ward's case is one of the most extensively documented child starvation deaths in Sacramento County history. The investigation that followed Shane's death revealed a prolonged period of severe neglect and deliberate deprivation. Shane Ward had not been a sickly or naturally underweight child. He had been denied food. He had been denied the basic sustenance that every 4-year-old child requires to live. The investigation also uncovered the involvement of Sacramento County Child Protective Services because Shane Ward was not invisible to the system. His family had been known to CPS. There had been prior contacts. There had been assessments. And Shane had still died, at 29 pounds, at 4 years old. Laverne Ward was charged with murder and child abuse. The prosecution built its case on the medical evidence of Shane's starvation, the timeline of his decline, and the systemic neglect that had caused his death. She was convicted. She was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. But the conviction of Laverne Ward did not close the larger story. The failure of Sacramento County CPS to prevent Shane's death triggered an internal investigation, an audit, and a period of public reckoning about the adequacy of California's child welfare system. The Sacramento Bee and other regional news organizations covered the aftermath extensively, documenting the institutional failures that had left a 4-year-old child to die of starvation in the 21st century in one of the most prosperous states in the world. Shane Ward, 4 years old, 29 pounds. There is no adequate language for this. There is only the obligation to say his name, to acknowledge what happened to him, and to demand better from the systems, from the communities, from the individuals charged with the welfare of children who cannot protect themselves. We say his name, Shane. We remember him. Case 10, Diane Woods. We come to our 10th and final case, and in some ways it is the hardest one to tell. Not because the facts are more extreme than what has come before, though they are devastating, but because it brings us to the edge of the question that sits underneath all 10 of these stories. How does this happen? In the San Bernardino County area of Southern California, in the mid-2000s, Diane Woods was a mother of multiple young children living in circumstances of profound poverty, substance dependency, and social isolation. She had been involved with Child Protective Services. Her children had been flagged, monitored, returned to her care, and flagged again in a cycle that is depressingly familiar in the case histories of the California child welfare system. In 2006, one of her children, a toddler, was found unresponsive in the family home. The child had been subjected to prolonged physical abuse and severe malnutrition. He died. The medical examiner's report documented injuries consistent with both acute physical abuse and a prolonged pattern of neglect and deprivation. This was not a single act of violence. This was a sustained environment of harm that had gone on for months. Diane Woods was arrested and charged with murder and child abuse. She was convicted. She was sentenced to a significant term of imprisonment. But in the aftermath of her conviction, investigators and child welfare advocates who examined the case history found, once again, the same pattern: documented risk, multiple prior contacts, insufficient intervention, a child dead. This is the 10th case. And across all 10 of these stories, across Sacramento and San Marcos and Perris and Orange County and Los Angeles and the Mojave and the Inland Empire and the Sierra Nevada foothills and the streets of California, there runs a single thread. These children were seen. They were documented. Some of them were flagged and visited and noted in files. Some of them were in homes that the system knew were dangerous. And the system, the same system that exists to protect them, failed them. Not in every case. Not through the malice of individual workers who were underpaid, overworked, and carrying more cases than any human being can adequately manage. But structurally, systematically, in ways that have been identified and re-identified and studied and reported on for decades without the fundamental conditions being changed. That is the thread. And it runs from Case 1 to Case 10, from 1984 to 2018, from the mountains to the desert, from Sacramento to San Diego. These are the names we carry out of this documentary: Brandon, Matthew, Nicholas, and Michael Eubanks, killed in their beds in San Marcos. Their mother is on death row. Sheila Sanders and Susan Knorr, tortured and killed by their mother in Sacramento over the course of years. Their remains lay unidentified for nearly a decade. We say their names. The Turpin children of Perris, 13 of them, chained in the dark, starved, isolated, and robbed of childhoods. They are alive, and some of them are healing, And that is both a miracle and an indictment of everything that allowed their suffering to go on for so long. Michael Mossip, 6 weeks old, gone before he had barely begun, in a tragedy at the intersection of maternal illness and legal complexity that this state still has not fully resolved. The victims of the Sunset Strip murders. Young women on the streets of Los Angeles whose deaths were connected to Carol Bundy's choices. Their names: Gina, Cynthia, Exie, Karen, Marnette, Mickey. The children of the desert, the children of the fire, the starved children in Sacramento. All real, all documented, all gone too soon or damaged in ways that will last their entire lives. And Shane Ward, 29 pounds, 4 years old. This has been Silent True Crime Stories. If this documentary moved you, if it stayed with you, if it made you think, if it made you want to demand better for children, then do something with that feeling. Hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more people. Leave a comment. Tell us which case stayed with you. Tell us what you think needs to change. Tell us you were here and you witnessed these stories. Subscribe to Silent True Crime Stories and ring that notification bell, because this channel will keep making documentaries like this one, because these children deserve to be remembered, and because silence is the thing that allowed so much of this to happen in the first place. We are not silent here. Until next time, we say their names. We remember them, and we do not look away.